They don't program society with bullets. They do it with silence, pressure, and repetition. Most people wake up already convinced of who they are, not because they discovered it, but because it was slowly handed to them by their parents, their school, their social media feed, and the fears no one ever helped them name. That's the first layer of Psyops. Make people internalize limitation. Teach them to equate survival with compliance. Make them shrink themselves in exchange for belonging. It works because it doesn't look like war. It looks like brunch conversations and job interviews. It looks like praise for being realistic. Meanwhile, you sat at the edge of all that. You saw the frame. You questioned why the same lives were lived by different faces. And they told you to be careful, to not overthink. But they were already broken. They just couldn't hear the sound of their own collapse. They cheer for dreams they never chased, quote thinkers they never studied, and mock people who deviate. Most aren't cruel. They're just calibrated to safety. And to them, anything that doesn't resemble the standard blueprint feels like a threat. That's how they protect the system, without knowing they're part of it. You spoke differently, so they labeled you difficult. You didn't beg for permission, so they called you arrogant. And when life hit, you didn't flinch the way they expected. That's when the tension started. Not because you attacked them, but because your refusal to fold exposed how quickly they did. That's the second layer of Psyops. Condition people to attack what they don't understand. They didn't notice you were trained differently, not with drills or gear, but with loss, pressure, and betrayal. Your childhood wasn't a playground, it was reconnaissance. You watched people lie to your face and call it love. You studied hypocrisy at the dinner table. You learned the patterns. That's where your real training happened. It wasn't pretty. There were no medals. But every moment taught you something: who folds, who manipulates, and who pretends. Special ops break because they're trained for enemies. You're built for ghosts. You know how to survive what's unspoken. That's what they can't process. You didn't walk through fire. You lived inside it. And now you can read people like maps. That's not ego. That's data. People thought your calm meant you didn't care. They mistook stillness for passivity. But you weren't zoning out, you were scanning. Every eye movement, every pause, every shift in tone, these were clues. You weren't waiting, you were calculating. That's what happens when someone's mind is forged in chaos. They don't need noise to function. They build silence into a weapon. And when things fall apart, they don't panic. They slow down. You never needed crowds. You needed clarity. And that made you dangerous in a world addicted to stimulation. While they spiraled in reaction, you became fluent in restraint. You saw the game behind the game, and you stopped playing by their rules. There's a reason they couldn't break you. They attacked what they thought was your identity, not knowing your real strength was invisibility. You didn't advertise your pain. You carried it like a shield. You didn't post every scar. You turned them into internal blueprints. So when they tried to destabilize you with gossip, abandonment, or psychological pressure, they expected collapse. What they met was architecture. Quiet, brutal, undeniable. Because you weren't chasing validation. You were watching who cracked under silence. And the moment they realized nothing they did could sway you, they stopped looking confident. That's when the fear started. Not of you, but of what you represented. Someone who saw through the entire illusion and walked anyway. They teach people to fear pain, but they never teach them to read it, so they numb. They buy things. They argue online. They avoid mirrors. You didn't have that luxury. Pain was your textbook. You studied grief like it had chapters. You didn't ask for shortcuts. You memorized every line of abandonment. Every betrayal had a fingerprint. That's why you don't overact. You already know where stories lead. They thought you were cold, but you were just accurate. That's another layer of psychological war. Make people ashamed of their perception. You didn't play that game. You trusted your pattern recognition, even when it made you lonely. Loneliness didn't break you. It clarified your signal. You stopped needing echo chambers and started seeking signal strength. You spoke less, observed more. And while others bonded over mutual delusions, you kept cleaning your lens. It wasn't about superiority. It was about survival. You knew early that if you compromised your vision for comfort, you'd lose everything. So you bore the silence. You watched the exits. You let people go when they revealed themselves. That discipline cost you relationships, but it preserved your clarity. And now when the world shakes, you're not guessing. You've already done the math. Most people think warfare is about fighting, but the real war is about attention. If they can hijack your focus, they can steer your choices. That's how systems control individuals, not through force, but through fixation. Keep them obsessed with trends, status, gossip, and you never need to chain them, they chain themselves. But you refused. You saw how every dopamine hit cost clarity, how every meaningless conversation diluted instinct. You stepped back, you simplified, you filtered. And in that process, you didn't just detox your mind, you recalibrated your power. While they consumed noise, you built silence into signal. You're not angry, you're not loud, you're calibrated. That's what makes them uneasy. They don't know how to provoke someone who doesn't perform. You don't react, you record. You don't expose, you remember. And when the time comes, your choices are silent executions. Not out of revenge, but out of clarity. You've seen what manipulation looks like when it wears a smile. You've watched cowards win in short-term cycles. But you're not here for rounds. You're built for the long war. And in that arena, stamina matters more than theatrics. They use shortcuts. You use solitude. They talk louder when they're losing control. It's a pattern. When their foundation begins to fracture, they don't rebuild. It's easier to narrate over the noise. They tell themselves they're evolving, that they're unbothered, that you're bitter. But the volume betrays them. Watch closely and you'll notice the most unstable people speak in absolutes. They need others to buy into their illusion just to believe it themselves. That's the tell. If someone truly felt grounded, they wouldn't need an audience. They wouldn't need applause after every breath. You, on the other hand, learned to move without a spotlight. Your silence was never emptiness. It was a sharpening. Every betrayal didn't make you colder, it made you quieter, more precise. You saw through the survival theater, the smiles hiding envy, the apologies hiding tactics. And instead of calling it out, you let them perform. Not because you were weak, but because you knew what most don't. Exposure is a short game, but observation rewires your entire strategy. Stillness wasn't something you found, it was something you had to earn. At first, you wanted to correct them. You wanted to defend your name, your version of the truth. But every time you did, it cost you peace. They weren't after clarity, they were after control. And the more you gave them energy, the more they grew. That was the breakthrough. You realized that some people thrive on chaos because it distracts them from confronting their own. So you stopped feeding it. You stopped answering questions you never asked. You stopped auditioning for people who decided their role before you walked onstage. That's where stillness became a tool. Not passive, not avoidant, strategic. While they kept running in circles, you learned to plant your feet. And slowly, their chaos became their own echo chamber. One you were never part of again. They built personalities on projections. Whatever they couldn't process in themselves, they assigned to you. If they were insecure, you were arrogant. If they were unstable, you were too much. It was never about you. You just became a mirror they didn't ask to see. That's why silence terrifies people like that. When you don't explain, they're forced to confront the stories they created, and most of them weren't built to hold up without opposition. That's the part they never calculate. You didn't play defense, not because you had nothing to say, but because their fiction wasn't worth your truth. That restraint, that's what separated you. While they tried to rally crowds, you built clarity. They spun narratives, you documented patterns, and in time, their need to perform burned them out. Meanwhile, you grew sharper in the dark. Stillness taught you to identify patterns most people overlook. The micro-hesitations, the inconsistent stories, the praise that felt performative. You stopped listening to words and started studying timing. Who checks in only after seeing you win? Who disappears when you need nothing from them? Who acts supportive until you enforce a boundary? These aren't petty details. They're psychological diagnostics. And once you see them clearly, you can never unsee them. That's the consequence of awareness. It upgrades your intuition, but costs you the comfort of illusion. You paid that price in full, and it hurt. Watching familiar faces distort, watching people rewrite history to preserve their ego, it bruised something sacred. But you didn't let it make you bitter. You let it make you selective. That's how stillness grows into wisdom. There's a moment when you realize that most people aren't choosing truth. They're choosing comfort. And if your truth threatens their comfort, they'll call it aggression. This is where most lose their grip. They try to fit back in. They water themselves down, make themselves small, easy to digest. You didn't. You chose exile over dilution. You'd rather be misjudged in silence than accepted through performance. That decision carved you into something rare, not detached, but unshakable, not hardened, but precise. You knew the difference between being ignored and being unseen. And you stopped handing out explanations to people who only heard what fit their story. That discipline. That's how your stillness became armor. Their chaos was addictive, at first. It kept you looping, explaining, chasing clarity in places that didn't value it. But chaos feeds on attention. And once you stopped feeding it, it turned on itself. You watched as the people who tried to handle. You began unraveling under the weight of their own contradictions. They couldn't sustain the character they built to diminish you. Their tone changed. Their eyes flickered. Their confidence broke in small, almost imperceptible cracks. Not because you attacked, but because you endured. And while they blamed others, while they searched for new scapegoats, you were somewhere else entirely, building a life so stable it became immune to their presence. People fear what they can't control. And nothing is harder to control than someone who doesn't seek validation. That's what made you dangerous. You didn't need them to believe your side. You didn't even need them to understand. You needed truth. And once you had that, their opinions became background noise. Most aren't ready for that kind of indifference. They mistake it for coldness. But it's precision. You know what's yours to carry. You know what's projection. That separation. That's how you moved without debris. While they clung to old battles, you built your own peace. It wasn't performative. It was quiet. And it was real. Stillness doesn't mean absence of emotion. It means control of reaction. You felt every betrayal, every lie, every manipulation disguised as help. But you sat with it. You didn't run. You didn't dump it on someone else. You studied it, and over time you stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what does this teach? That's when the transformation started. You stopped romanticizing potential. You stopped rewriting patterns just to make someone look better in hindsight. You accepted what they showed you. And in that acceptance, you found your leverage. Not to harm, but to never be caught off guard again. You don't need revenge. Your peace is revenge. Your ability to keep growing, keep building, without carrying the weight of what they did. That's what unsettles them. They thought they broke something. They didn't realize you were already breaking the cycle. And now, they don't know how to reach you. Because the version of you that entertained their chaos no longer exists. You didn't evolve. You transformed. Stillness wasn't just your response. It was your rebirth.